Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine waking up on a crisp September morning. You've got a headache or maybe just a slight fever, right? So you do what millions of us do every single day without even giving it a second thought. You walk into a pharmacy, grab a trusted household staple right off the shelf, and pop a pill. It's an incredibly ordinary act. But back in September of 1982, for 7 people in the Chicago area, that perfectly ordinary act became a literal, deadly game of roulette. See, extra-strength Tylenol capsules had been secretly laced with a lethal dose of cyanide. And this wasn't some weird factory error or a manufacturing defect. No, someone deliberately poisoned those capsules after they had already reached the store shelves. In just a matter of hours, a brand that practically lived in every single American medicine cabinet was transformed into a lethal weapon. Suddenly, you've got 7 lives tragically cut short, leaving families just completely shattered, and honestly, an entire nation paralyzed with fear.
Now put yourself in that boardroom. Consider the impossible, agonizing question Johnson & Johnson suddenly faced. Do you protect the product, the company, or the public? I mean, the media was absolutely scrambling for answers. Phones were ringing off the hook. The extreme uncertainty of that exact moment was, well, it was paralyzing. They didn't know how many bottles were poisoned. They had no idea if the tampered products were confined just to Chicago or if they had spread across the entire country. And most horrifyingly, they didn't know who might be next. It's exactly the kind of high-stakes corporate thriller scenario where most executives just completely freeze, desperately waiting for perfect information before making a single move. But the terrifying reality? Waiting meant more people could die.
Section 1. The nightmare begins.
Section 2. People before product. So, facing this absolute nightmare, Johnson & Johnson easily could have taken a deeply defensive stance. They could have argued that the tampering happened at the retail level, which, by the way, was entirely true, and just said it wasn't their fault. They could have blamed local distributors or limited their response to just a few specific neighborhoods in Chicago. Or, they could have just hidden behind an absolute army of corporate lawyers. But instead, they made a staggering choice. They ordered a massive national recall of 31 million bottles. 31 million! Just think about the sheer physical logistics of that decision for a second. Delivery trucks literally turning around on the highway, store clerks frantically clearing end caps and sweeping bottles into trash bags. It was one of the most significant recalls in history at the time. And the immediate evaporation of millions of dollars? Incredibly disruptive. It created immense short-term financial pain. But, and this is absolutely crucial, this is exactly when crisis management becomes trust management. Because people do not care what leaders say during a crisis. They watch what leaders actually prioritize. And J&J showed everyone they were willing to bleed money to keep people safe.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it actually drove that massive recall. What we're looking at is a line from the Johnson & Johnson corporate credo. It clearly states their primary responsibility is to doctors, nurses, patients, mothers, fathers, long before their responsibility to shareholders. During the utter, chaotic panic of 1982, this wasn't just some nice little paragraph buried on page 40 of an annual report. No, these values acted as a very real, practical compass in the dark. When you have a true north like this, it cuts right through all those heated boardroom arguments. It dictates your actions, even when those actions are going to cost you over $100 million.
Section 3. The strategy of truth.
Because they had that credo guiding them, Johnson & Johnson moved with completely unprecedented speed. They didn't wait around to have all the answers neatly tied up with a bow. Instead of that typical, sweaty, door-closing corporate cover-up where executives ask, hey, how do we protect ourselves? They threw their doors wide open. They partnered directly with law enforcement and the media. They asked, what do people need to know right now, and treated the whole situation as the massive public health emergency that it was. They issued widespread warnings telling the public absolutely not to consume any Tylenol capsules. Why? Because in a crisis, silence sounds exactly like avoidance. If leaders delay, or if they just give these vague, defensive, lawyer-approved answers, rumors immediately fill the gap, and public trust just collapses. By choosing radical transparency, J&J positioned themselves as part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Section 4. Rebuilding through real change.
Let's move to and see how this builds into real, tangible action. The recall was successful, right? The immediate danger was managed. But PR spins and excellent communication alone were not going to be enough to save the brand. If J&J wanted Tylenol back on those shelves, they had to physically redesign the entire product experience. You can't just say, hey, trust us after a massive tragedy. You actually have to prove it through engineering. So Johnson & Johnson pioneered and introduced tamper-resistant packaging. We totally take it for granted now, but think about the first time you had to peel back a foil seal or pull out that really tight cotton wad. They implemented far stronger sealing approaches that made tampering significantly harder. These physical design changes didn't just fix Tylenol, they entirely shifted consumer and regulatory expectations across the entire over-the-counter medicine industry. They essentially proved to the public that real structural lessons were learned, and more importantly, implemented.
Section 5. The legacy of trust.
So why did the Tylenol brand survive when so many other brands completely collapsed after a crisis involving fatalities? Well, it really comes down to this vital concept called moral memory. The brand recovered because the public remembered exactly how Johnson & Johnson behaved when the intense pressure was on. They didn't just remember the tragedy itself, they held a moral memory of J&J's quick, responsible, and incredibly selfless actions. Now look, we do have to be careful not to oversimplify this legendary case. We must remember this stems from a horrific tragedy where 7 innocent people lost their lives. And let's face it, modern crises are incredibly messy. Today, we're dealing with instant viral misinformation, wildly complex global supply chains, and deeply contested facts. You can't just copy-paste the 1982 Tylenol playbook into a 21st century issue and expect it to work perfectly. However, the core foundational principles they established, those absolutely still apply today.
All right, let's distill the essential takeaways from this explainer so far. First, public safety must absolutely always come first. Second, speed matters. Delayed communication doesn't magically buy you time, it just fuels public fear. Third, transparency builds your credibility. You don't need to have all the answers immediately, but you must be upfront and honest about what you do and don't know. And fourth, values must guide difficult decisions. I mean, having a corporate credo means absolutely nothing unless it literally forces your hand when you're making those painful, costly trade-offs.
Continuing with our final lessons. Fifth, trust requires real operational change. PR spins don't work long-term. You need physical, tangible actions, exactly like we saw with that packaging redesign. Sixth, media engagement must be responsible and informative, not some defensive spin to control a narrative. And finally, number 7, reputation is rebuilt through sacrifice. Johnson & Johnson accepted massive short-term commercial damage to secure their long-term brand survival. They didn't prioritize the next quarter's earnings. No, they prioritized the next decade of trust.
So the crucial point is really this. Trust is not rebuilt by words, it is rebuilt by decisions. When the dust finally settles on a disaster, it's the hard choices and the financial sacrifices that people actually remember. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. If a catastrophic, completely unexpected crisis struck your organization tomorrow, what would your immediate decisions reveal about what you truly